Well, I have not had nearly enough coffee, and I'm in deep depression after watching my Wildcats get beat for a second game in a row. They just look awful, just awful. So I'm not looking forward to March at this point. I was a month ago, but I'm not now. We're jumping in. Again, this morning we'll look at parts of Exodus, Numbers, all kinds of stuff. Now, Leviticus, before we get going here, it's important you understand something. You see this all the time in the world of Facebook, where, people love to put memes. You know what a meme is? A meme is a little picture with a saying, all that kind of stuff. And people love, atheists, skeptics, agnostics, Muslims, so forth, love to attack Christianity, and they love to do it especially through the Old Testament. They quote things out of context in the Old Testament all the time. There's a problem with this. Anybody know what the problem with that is? We're under a new covenant that has nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever. You do not live by Leviticus. Leviticus is a great historical study. It has nothing to do with living as a Christian today. Absolutely. We are not under the law. The only laws we are under are those that are affirmed in the New Testament by the New Testament writers. That's it. And so you've got to understand that. So when people do that, they're misquoting text. So understand again, Leviticus only, the laws in Leviticus only applied to Israel at that time and at that place. That's it. And the reason that law was given to Israel at that time and at that place was because they were given a mission. Israel's mission was to do what? Come on. Don't let me down. Come on. To bring people to worship the one true God. In almost all the world, they were polytheistic. They worshiped many, many gods. Even through the Roman Empire, there were many, many gods. And so when the Jews come along and say there's only one God, and it is Yahweh, this was revolutionary. I mean, people didn't understand it. And at first, especially, a lot of people just said, well, okay, I'll worship Yahweh, and I'll worship this God, and this God, and this God, and this God. And they're just like, no, that's how it works. And so the law was given to set Israel apart at that time and at that place, to bring other people to worship the one true God. Okay, so Leviticus is focused on that, on how Israel is being set apart and on the holiness of God. But what about some of this? Why some of these rules? For example, what about the prohibition against eating anything with blood in it? How many of you like your steak bloody? Like it? All right, I think that's weird. You guys are weirdos, but so be it. I like mine well done, but I like, no, if you cook it right, it's good stuff. But the reason that there are a couple reasons why Israel was prohibited from eating anything with blood in it. Number one was the pagans did it. The other pagan religions. In fact, you see this in many barbaric religions where sometimes a test would be they would rip the heart out of an animal and you had to eat it. And so it was a pagan practice, and Israel was forbidden to do anything that their pagan neighbors did. Now, there's also some health, reasons for not, digging into blood, but especially in that time and place. But there's also another reason. Blood had a very special purpose in the Old Testament, which was what? It was used for sacrifice. It was used for atonement. It was also, God is setting apart blood to be used only for atonement of sins and not to be ingested. Make sense? All right. But what's this deal with, you get to this, and both men and women, atheists love to pick on that women that during their menstrual period are not allowed, or after they give birth, are not allowed to approach the tabernacle, are not allowed to approach God. They're ceremoniously put unclean. Men also, though, if you had discharge of any kind, men were not allowed to approach either. It actually applied to both. Why? This comes up in Leviticus 15. Now, here's the deal, and this is tough for people today to accept in our PC culture and so forth. People don't like this. This is the way it was, and there's no way to really whitewash this. If you had any kind of imperfection at all, you were not allowed to approach the tabernacle. That sounds harsh, but there was a reason for it. The reason is what, if you had to guess? Well, there's part of it is just, again, there's a health, part to it, because some Hebrew scholars have, how do I put this delicately? That when it talks about men and their discharge, it's talking about STDs, and so there's a good reason to separate them from the clan for a while. But it also had to do with the holiness and the perfection of God. That you were to be, not only could you not approach with any imperfection or any illness, you could not, approach unless you were also clean. You had to go through a ceremonial cleaning. You had to, kind of like an early foreshadowing of baptism. You had to be completely clean before you approached the tabernacle, because the emphasis was on the perfection and holiness of God. Now, I'm not a Catholic, I'm not an Anglican, I'm what they call a low church guy. I'm getting ready to preach in jeans and a t-shirt. I'm all for that, I'm all for modern music. But there is something to the church tradition emphasizing the holiness of God and the fear of God, which we have kind of lost in Protestant Christianity, haven't we? And too often it's God as our buddy theology, which doesn't work. We've lost that kind of fear of God. But in fact, when you see this, again and again, what happens in the Bible when people are confronted with the holiness of God? Whether it's Isaiah or whether it's Peter when he realizes Jesus is the Christ. Away from me, I am a sinful person. But when you are confronted with the holiness of God, you are also confronted with your own unholiness. And you feel shame, you feel fear, you feel unclean. And there was a reason, there's a theological reason for this, to stress the holiness of God. The Israelites only behaved themselves when they were about ready to pee their pants. Other than that, they're just a completely rebellious bunch. It's only when the mountains are shaking and there's lightning and thunder, they're like, okay. The moment God is distant, what happens? What happens when Moses goes up on the mountain? He's up there hanging out with God for a month or two. They start partying and they put up a false god and all that kind of stuff. And then Aaron lies. And, well, they threw a bunch of stuff in the fire and out came a golden calf. So, of course, Aaron became a preacher because that kind of liar. But that kind of imperfection, again, it's just focusing on the holiness of God. It does not mean God does not love those people. It's just the emphasis on God, not the people. And you got to keep that in mind. All right, what about Leviticus 29? Here's another one people love to point out. If anyone curses his father and mother, he must be put to death. He has cursed his father and mother. His blood guilt is on himself. Parents, don't you wish you still had that in your arsenal? Be honest, right? It's like the old Bill Cosby line. It says, look, I'll take you out. It doesn't bother me because I'll make another one look just like you, right? Okay, it sounds harsh. But it's not talking about a kid mouthing off. The Hebrew word there for curse is not just some kid being snarky or smart-alecky. If that were the case, Israel never would have had a child live to 12, right? They'd all been dead. A curse is worse than that. It's really almost calling down death. It's that serious. And it's also a pagan practice. Again, the pagans did that. They called down curses, almost like, Megan and I were talking about this week, voodoo. You see this how many of you anybody been to Haiti? I know some here in the church have. Rick's been. If you go to Haiti, voodoo is still alive and well. And so voodoo is a pagan religion. One of the things they do is they curse. You can go to a witch doctor and have him curse somebody would bring all kinds of ill and that kind of stuff on. That's what it's talking about. It's not talking about a kid being mouthy. It's about a kid engaging in a pagan practice that the Canaanites there did. Make sense? All right. But now we come to something pretty sticky. You see in Exodus 21, you see in Leviticus 25. What about slavery in the Old Testament? Yeah, nobody likes that one, right? That's a source of embarrassment. Well, it was there. We can't whitewash that. Slavery was there. But we need to understand something. One, slavery in the Bible is not the same as slavery that was practiced here in the United States up until the end of the Civil War. Not the same thing. That was racially based. Slavery in the Old Testament had nothing to do with race. Absolutely nothing. It had everything to do with, one, you were a conquered people, or, as is often the case, people would actually sell themselves into slavery. It's called a bondservant. You would sell yourself into slavery. Anybody understand why would somebody sell themselves into slavery? They're impoverished. They're homeless and impoverished, and they have nothing. And this is, now in Israel, in order for you, if you were an Israelite especially, for you to become homeless and impoverished means you sold your own land, because everybody was given land. And in fact, under the Jubilee laws, if you did sell it, you were supposed to get it back. You could only really rent it out for so many years, basically a generation, and then you got it back. So for somebody, for an Israelite especially, to have to sell himself into slavery usually means they're a drunken idiot. I mean, you really have to be stupid to get to the point where you have to sell yourself into slavery in the Old Testament. And even though this is embarrassing, you need to understand something. There were laws governing slavery in the Old Testament. For example, if you killed your slave, guess what? You got the death penalty. Now, in 19th century America, if you owned a slave, you had power, life, and death over them. You could do whatever you wanted. But in Israel, if you had a slave, you had to treat that slave like a member of the household. You had to treat them like a son, a daughter, or a brother. You had to treat them well. And if you beat them, it actually says, first of all, it was really stupid for anyone to beat a slave. Can you guess why? You're not going to get any work out of it. I mean, yeah, that's the whole reason to have slaves is to work your farm. So there's an agricultural society. If you beat them to where they couldn't work, you're just hurting yourself. But if you went so far as to kill them, Leviticus says you will be killed. You will face the death penalty. You were to treat them like you want to be treated. And in fact, we also see that typically slaves, however, were Canaanites. Now, they were not supposed to be slaves. This is where you have to put things in context. God did not want the Israelites to have Canaanites as slaves, but he knew they would. And this is why he had the laws. Why didn't he want them to have them as slaves? What did he tell Israel to do to the Canaanites? He tells them, we're going to talk about that in a second, but essentially really what he tells us is drive them out. Get them out of there. Drive them out of the land, he says, because if they hang around, what are they going to do? They're going to corrupt you. They're going to lead you into pagan practices. So you need to drive them out of the land, completely drive them out. So when he talks about having slaves from these people, he's putting laws. God is putting laws in because in his foreknowledge, he knows what they're going to do. They're going to disobey. In fact, Moses says this. Here's what you're to do, but you ain't going to do it. Moses tells them that. You're going to screw up because that's the kind of people you are. That's how I should preach all my sermons. And that's what Moses tells them to do. He says that you're going to screw this up. And so when you do this. This is his point when he gives, a writ of divorce, and they could, the Pharisees, confront Jesus and said, why did Moses, allow divorce? He said, because you're a bunch of hard-hearted jerks, and he knew he would have to do something. That's not what he wanted. It's the same thing with laws about slavery. He did not want them to take slaves, either of their fellow Israelites or the Canaanites. He wanted to drive out the Canaanites and to treat every Israelite like a brother and sister. But he said, but I know you're not going to do that. So here's what's going to happen. When you go and do it, you're not going to kill them. You're going to treat them like a member of the family. That's how it's going to be. And so it's really because God is seeing that they're going to be sinful, and that's where these laws come from. And if you were an Israelite who sold yourself into slavery, were you a slave forever? Nope, you were not. You had to be freed on the year of Jubilee. Every 7 years, and then every 49 years, they would have what's called Jubilee. And in Jubilee, they were supposed to. There's no evidence they ever practiced it because, again, they were a sinful bunch who didn't pay attention to law. But they were supposed to have a year of Jubilee where they returned all property back to the original owners and they freed anyone who was a slave. That was the law. They didn't necessarily stick to it, but that was the way they were supposed to be treated. Make sense? We're tracking so far? All righty. They were also supposed to do this. Now, this is what drives me crazy. So atheists go to the Old Testament and they pick out things out of context. They never put in the stuff there that kind of softens all that kind of stuff. And here's what they also don't do. They don't point out how revolutionary Israel was. No other nation in the world at that time treated a certain number of people, 3 in particular, very well. Can you guess who those were?
Slaves, women.
Widows, orphans, foreigners. In fact, all throughout the Old Testament law, you see this repeated again and again and again, where God says, you see this in Exodus 22, you see this all over the place, where God says, if the widow or the orphan or the stranger cry out to me, I'm holding you responsible. He tells them that no widow, orphan, or foreigner within your borders cry out to me in hunger or injustice or whatever, or I'm holding you as a nation totally responsible. That was revolutionary, folks, because most people in the Middle East, in fact, in certain corners of the Middle East, even today, there's a saying that if you see a blind beggar, kick him, because why should you be better to him than his God has been? And in fact, this is one of the reasons why I just finished a really good book on the history of the Roman Empire, a book called, it's titled SPQR by Mary Beard, she's a wackadoodle British professor over at Cambridge. She's a total weirdo, but she is a good historian. She doesn't understand Christianity at all, but when she deals with the Roman Empire, she's got a pretty good head on her shoulders. And one of the things that Mary Beard points out is one of the reasons Rome hated Christianity so much. Up until the Emperor Constantine, there was either sporadic or systemized persecution of the Christian church. And you want to know what Rome's biggest beef was? It was not just that they called Jesus Lord, they didn't like that. It's not just that they didn't also worship Caesar, though they didn't like that. You were supposed to worship Caesar as a god if you were a good Roman, and Christians refused to do that, and that did get them in a lot of trouble. That's, in fact, the entire background of the book of Revelation. The biggest problem from writings we see, like Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman senator, writing goes, can you believe these Christians? They take care of the poor. Can you believe that? You know what the Roman solution was to the poor? Well, they die, they're not a problem anymore. As soon as they starve to death, we won't have to deal with them. That was the Roman Empire solution. And Mary Beard notes this in SPQR. It said basically, every once if Caesar or somebody running for Senate wanted to buy votes, they'd hand out food to the poor. That's how they bought votes. But typically it was, you're hungry? Sucks to be you. See ya. And that was it. And so Christians come along and they start feeding the poor, caring for those. You have these incredible scenes of Christians going into towns where the plague is and caring for the sick and risking their own lives to do it. You have stories of Christians going to see, because in Rome, now abortion is nothing new. Abortion's been around for thousands of years. It was practiced by the Greeks, it was practiced by the Romans, but it was risky to have an abortion. Because it's essentially what they do is they just stick a knife up in the uterus and cut up the baby. And so that risked, of course, cutting up the pregnant woman as well, so abortion was risky. So typically what a woman did if she didn't want a baby is she'd have the baby, and then they just throw the baby out on a trash pile, alive. What the Christians did, went every morning in a trash pile, started picking up the babies, taking them home and raising them. And the Romans were like, can you believe that? What are they doing? And they were offended. Now you understand why Paul says the foolishness of the gospel, right? They're not going to get this. Because it was so countercultural. You need to understand this. As much as this is what's funny, atheists like to scream about the Judeo-Christian ethic. The problem is, where did they get their own ethics? This is what Frank Turek in his book Stealing from God is. It's so funny that atheists use biblical morality to criticize morality, biblical morality. Where else are they getting it? If you don't have a moral that comes from God, where's it from? It's just your own opinion, and who cares? Just your own preference. Why do I care about your own preference? But it was absolutely revolutionary. You've got to understand what Christianity, because you see this in Exodus 23, you see this in Leviticus 23, you see this all the time. One of the things that all Israelites, and remember that with the exception of the priests, because they had their own deal, every Israelite was basically a farmer. And so that's how you fed yourself, that's how you did commerce, is that they were almost all farmers. Every farmer in Israel was told that when you go out to reap, and when you reap, if anything falls to the ground, what do you do with it? Leave it there. And he says, not only that, the edges of your harvest, you're to leave there as well. And that is to be for the poor.
So they can maintain their dignity and not have to beg.
They don't have to beg. They can just come after everybody's done, about dusk, when everybody's going in to eat dinner. They can go and pick up their food and take it home. No other nation in history had ever done that. And so you get these people who like to criticize the harshness of the Old Testament. Richard Dawkins goes on and says, how mean. He says, this is a quote from Richard Dawkins from his book, The God Delusion. He's one of the nastiest neo-atheists out there. He says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it. Petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, it goes on, a megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capricious, malevolent bully who is the only God calling to care for the poor. Richard. If Richard had his way, the poor were just a start. This was absolutely revolutionary, and so you need to keep that in mind. You cannot find anywhere else in the ancient world where any God says, if a widow, orphan, or foreigner cry out to me, I will hold you as a nation totally responsible. You will care for the widow, the orphan. And this comes in the New Testament too. Read your book of James? What does James say is true religion? Caring for the widow and the orphan. We're still called to do that. I'm not trying to get political, but according to the Bible, ain't the government's job, that's our job.
Doesn't happen much.
In the New Testament, you leave out the stranger.
No, because in the New Testament, there is no stranger because they're called to go to the entire world, right? Christians are the new Israel. We're no longer a nation, we're a kingdom. And we're a kingdom that's supposed to go out into the nations.
But that word was no different.
Well, but why? Is my point. There's not supposed to be any strangers. There's neither Jew nor Greek. Galatians. There's neither male nor female within the kingdom. There is no hierarchy. There is no stranger. We're to seek to enlarge the kingdom with whoever we meet. All righty. That's how we doing so far. Good. What about the commands to commit genocide? This is another big one. This is what Dawkins and the neo-atheists say. You read there, and Israel is told to go and kill every man, woman, and child in Canaan, and isn't that just nasty? Well, there's a problem with that. There's a wonderful little book. It's not a big book. It's only about 120 pages or so, by a philosopher down in Florida named Paul Copan. We're in a book called Is God a Moral Monster? And he deals exclusively with this. And here's what he writes. He says, first of all, the wording should be understood in the context of ancient Near Eastern military narrative. The argument goes, ancient writings commonly traded in hyperbolic exaggeration for the sake of emphasis, especially when it came to military conquest. The practice is evident throughout battle reports of the time. Joshua's conventional warfare rhetoric, Copan writes, was common in many ancient Near Eastern military accounts in the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. In other words, how many of you played football in high school? Some of you? I played through my sophomore year. By played, I was on the team. And I was only on the team because in Wheelersburg at the time, you either were on the football team or you were wearing a dress, one or the other. So that's just how it worked. But and then thank God when I went to private school in California, they weren't big enough to have a football team, so it didn't matter. But our coaches used to get in front of us, and what would they say for a game? We're going to kill them. We're going to destroy them. Okay, that never happened. We had pads on. In fact, somebody got injured. Everybody was like, you know. But that's why our coaches thought, we're going to destroy them. We're going to kill them. We're going to, you know. But it never got that out of hand, to be honest. There were times. I remember once when I was a freshman, we had a fight with PHS. I always remember how dumb that was. Like, okay, we're wearing pads and helmets, and we're going to have a fist fight. And I remember some guy, not to pick on Portsmouth, some guy took his helmet off, and I'm thinking, boy, you're all kinds of stupid, aren't you? To be honest, you're just asking for that punch. I'm just telling you, you know. I left my helmet on. But this is how you talk. And so it was the same way in military news. You're going to go destroy them. This was common. This is how you spoke. And so Copan goes on and says, therefore, phrases like utterly destroy, haram, or put to death men and women and children and infants, as well as other obliteration language, were stock stereotypical idioms used, even when women or children were not present, and they weren't. When we dug up Jericho, as best we can tell from Jericho, the only women there were women like Rahab. You know what I mean by that? Because when you have a bunch of soldiers, the oldest profession shows up, right? And so there were no, when they destroyed Jericho, there was nothing but male soldiers there. They had a prostitute, and she got out. And so these were stereotypical idioms that decreed total victory, not complete annihilation. Second, Copan argues women and children weren't even targets as the attacks were, as I said, directed at smaller military outposts, characteristically holding soldiers, not non-combatants who generally lived out in outlying rural areas. All of the archaeological evidence indicates that no civilian populations existed at Jericho or Ai or any other cities mentioned in Joshua. They were just male soldiers. Third, on Copan's view, the main purpose of the conquest was not annihilation, but expulsion, driving the inhabitants out and cleansing the land of idolatry by destroying every vestige of the evil Canaanite religion. And it was evil. We talked about this last week. Understand, Canaanites did things like sell their children into prostitution and offered up their firstborn as human sacrifice. I mean, it was nasty. Absolutely nasty. And so this is why in Deuteronomy 7:1-5 says, you shall tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, and hew down their Asherah poles and burn their graven images with fire. Further, if I can get my computer to work.
You answer the question, you've got, am I allowed to ask questions?
Yep, make it easy.
You got someone that says, well, I thought all sins were equal, and you're driving out or killing people that are giving up their firstborn, they're selling their kids into prostitution, but yet they say a prostitute.
A couple things. One is that in the Old Testament, you're dealing with a different covenant. And so it's not the same. And first of all sins were not forgiven in the Old Testament. They were just covered over, as Hebrews tells us. The question was, are all sins the same? And my answer to that is yes and no. One sin is treason against God, and therefore you deserve hell for even one sin. But not all sin is equal in the fact that not all of them have the same effect. And God, it also states, remember that in the book of the law, in the Tanakh, God says that he'd been patient with Canaan for a long time. He said, look, this has been coming hundreds of years, and they refuse to repent. And even then, what does he tell Joshua to do? He doesn't tell Joshua, he tells Joshua, said that you go to the city gates, which means if they had a city gate, that means it was a military outpost. You go and you say, hey, look, surrender, or we're going to destroy you. And so he gave them terms of surrender. So if they refuse, that's on them. But you also have to factor in God's foreknowledge. God is saying that I have seen, and this is where This is where our buddy William Lane Craig comes in. God not only foresees what will happen, God foresees what could happen. And he says that, he tells the Israelites, if you don't do this, what's going to happen? You're going to be led astray. Which is exactly what happened. So he sees this, and he also, with his foreknowledge, sees that they're not going to repent. If God calls down destruction on you, he basically states in the Bible, that's because he knows beforehand, you're not going to repent. You're just going to continue going on doing what you're going to do. And so his patience has an end. God has a long fuse, but it is a fuse, and it will come to an end. I tell people all the time, I encounter people all the time who tell me, oh, I'll get to church one day. I'll get to church. Yeah, one of these days I'll get my butt to church and I'll get right with God. And I'm sitting there thinking, do you know when Jesus is going to return? Because I don't. And when he returns, guess what? Too late. So, but it's true that if you read through these scriptures carefully, it says that God really did not want to destroy them. He wanted to drive them out of the land. He says this again and again. And he says in Deuteronomy 7, the Lord your God will clear away these nations before you little by little. You will not be able to put an end to them quickly, for the wild beast would grow too numerous for you. And if you go on and read Joshua, you see what happened. But you also see that Canaanites continue. In fact, in Joshua 10 and 11, it says Joshua, conquered all of the tribes. But then you read later and it says the Canaanites are still there. Well, I thought Joshua says he was successful. He did what God told him to do. Then the Canaanites are still there. Which means that God, when he declared success, did not mean he wanted them all destroyed, but he did want the military outposts cleared out. He wanted Jericho and Ai and so forth, those military fortresses, he wanted those torn down. And he also wanted all the pagan religions kicked out of there. So keep that in mind. You got to read that carefully and you got to keep things in context. Does that make sense? Okay.
He wanted their idols destroyed.
Yes. He did want their idols destroyed. He was very clear that all the what's called Asherah poles, so forth, get rid of all those. And apparently Joshua did that, but then the Canaanites who remained apparently started to rebuild them. And then you get into the book of Judges and you see that, just all what's broken loose. I get this all the time. You need to understand this. We have done a great disservice to the Old Testament. We've treated the Old Testament like it's the kids' Bible. And I understand why, because they're talking animals in it, so we think it's like a Pixar movie. And so we just treat it that way, and almost 90% of all Sunday school lessons to kids are about the Old Testament. There's always a little moral story at the end and so forth. That is not the Old Testament. Try reading the Old Testament to your kids at night. Yeah, they'll have nightmares, right? Try that. You get a little 3 or 4-year-old there, and then the angel of death struck down every firstborn child in Egypt. Good night, buddy. Sleep tight. Dad, can you put some blood on the door? It's not that you get to Judges. Goodness sakes. There's one scene where a prostitute is literally chopped up and FedExed all across the country. I'm not joking. Have you read it? Jeez. This was a wholly, no pun intended, wholly and barbaric world in which Israel is called to minister to. It's just nasty. And so I get these people that say, oh, look how mean God is. He's saying to do all this and destroy Jericho and destroy Ai. Did you feel sorry for the Nazis when they were firebombed? Well, the Nazis the Canaanites make the Nazis look like Boy Scouts. Give me a break. Oh boy. All right. Anything else on that before we move on? We're going to jump to 1 Samuel. Let's deal with some confusion, shall we? In 1 Samuel 16, 19 through 23, let's look a little bit at David and Saul here, because there seems to be some confusion. 16, 19 through 23. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who was out with the sheep. So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a container of wine, a young goat, and sent them to Saul with his son David. David came to Saul and stood before him. Saul liked him a great deal, and he became his armor bearer. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, let David be my servant, for I really like him. So whenever a spirit from God would come upon Saul, David would take his lyre and play it, and this would bring relief to Saul and make him feel better, and then the evil spirit would leave him alone. Then you jump to 17:55 through 58. Now, as Saul watched David going out to fight the Philistines, he asked Abner, the general and commander of the army, whose son is this young man, Abner? Abner replied, as surely as you live, O king, I don't know. The king said, find out whose son this boy is. So when David returned from striking down the Philistine, this is after he kills Goliath, Abner took him and brought him before Saul. He still had the head of the Philistine in his hand. Do you read that one on Sunday school with the kids? Let me do that. I love that. That's I come in, there's a bloody stump. Here you go. Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David replied, I am the son of your servant Jesse in Bethlehem. Well, which one is it? Did Saul know David or not?
What kind of craft do you make for that purpose?
Yeah, what's going on there? Yeah, exactly. What kind of craft after that Sunday school lesson? Let's all go make a bloody head. There are a couple possibilities. Number one, you need to understand it was not uncommon for ancient writers to put things out of order in order to make a point. For example, the Gospel of John does this. The Gospel of John puts Jesus' clearing of the temple at the beginning of the Gospel of John. The other Gospels put it at the end. And it's almost certainly the number one reason why Jesus was killed, was the cleansing of the temple. Because at that time and that place, to cleanse the temple meant claiming authority over a temple. The only person who could claim authority over a temple was the Messiah. So Jesus was claiming messiahship when he did that. And that's what John puts it at the beginning of the gospel because it fits in with the sermon that he's preaching. And it's really more of a sermon than it is history. And so you need to understand that. So it could have been out of order because almost all of 1 Samuel is really highlighting two things: the Israelites' rebellion against having God as king and Saul's failure. And Saul screwed up again and again and again and again. There's another possibility. It says that David came and played his instrument and sang for Saul to kind of whenever he had the blues or whatever, whenever he was depressed. And then it says later that he killed Goliath. It does not tell us what the time gap is there. Ever seen a kid and then you see him years later and you don't recognize him? They do grow and they do change. And we don't know what the time gap is there. It could have been years. If David came and played for him when he was like 8 or 9 years old and now he's like 15, 16, he's going to look a little different. So that's also a possibility. Any questions there before we move on? All right. Now here's another one. Why did God allow David, Solomon, and others to have all those wives? Because he could?
He wanted to punish him.
Oh. He wanted to punish him. Oh, man. That's funny. It's really not. Well, obviously they didn't have you as a wife, honey, and so that's why it was punishment. Anyway, first of all, if you go to Deuteronomy 17, God actually prohibits it. God says, first of all, he says you shouldn't have kings, but then what does he say? This is Moses. Moses' sermon in Deuteronomy is great reading. And it's a sermon by Moses. And he keeps saying, look, don't do this, but when you do it, God is your king. You're not supposed to have men as kings. All right, but when you get a man as a king, they're not to have multiple wives. What do? They get multiple wives. All right, it's not that, God allowed it. I mean, they are sinning. They are violating the law. I heard one sermon that said, goodness sakes, could you imagine what David would be like if he hadn't been a man after God's own heart? Whew! I mean, he commits murder and adultery and has multiple wives as a faithful God worshiper. If he hadn't been, goodness sakes. And second, the ideal has always been one man, one woman, Genesis 2:24. And in Genesis, and by the way, because I've heard this one, in Genesis 2:24, when it says man and woman together, it's singular, not plural. Sorry. So it's one man, one woman. Now, there are, however, some practical reasons why God tolerated it. And here's why. Before the Greeks and Romans established an empire-wide kind of rule of law, it was common for there to be many more women than men. Anybody understand? Anyone take a guess why?
Military.
Wars. Wars. Yeah. Because kingdoms were constantly at war. And so when kingdoms are constantly at war, men get killed and there are widows. And in this patriarchal culture, women had two options: get married and be a housewife, or be a prostitute. That's it. And so if you didn't want to be a prostitute, you had to get married. And what happens when you only got so many men and so many more women? You get multiple marriages. That's what happens. No excuse today, George, sorry, because women can fend for themselves. Forget it. Sisters are doing it for themselves, so it's no longer. So that's, I think, why God tolerated it. God did not want it, but he tolerated it. Does that make sense?
Look how well it worked out for him that did it.
Oh, goodness sakes, yeah. And you get, even with David, I mean, Solomon's led astray, but even David, I mean, his wife Michal was just a constant pain in the butt. The few times that Michal pops up, she's giving David the business, right? Look at you making a fool of yourself out there. Not that a wife would ever do such a thing, would ever say anything like that. Watch it.
That's what them concubines.
Oh, boy. Oh, no. Anyway. Concubines were essentially wives as well. They were wives, but they typically it's kind of, some scholars refer to them as junior wives because typically concubines were not Israelites. I apologize. Whew, all right. All right, let's look at another passage that gives people some fits. Let's go to 2 Samuel 6. 2 Samuel 6. 1 Samuel talks more about Saul. 2 Samuel talks more about David. 1 Samuel does, sorry. All right. 6 through 10. When they arrived at the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out, grabbed hold of the ark of God, because the oxen stumbled. The Lord was so furious with Uzzah, he killed him on the spot for his negligence. He died there beside the ark of God. David was angry because the Lord attacked Uzzah. So he called the place Perez Uzzah, which remains its name to this very day. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How will the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" So David was no longer willing to bring the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. David left it in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Now, seem a little harsh? Does it? Well, here's where you need to read a little bit more carefully. In 2 Samuel 6, 1 through 4, where does it say the ark had been? Uzzah's house. It's been sitting in Uzzah's back room for a long time. So that's one. Now, are there procedures that God gave the Israelites for moving the ark, how they're to move the ark?
Yes.
Did they follow it? Nope. In Exodus 25, 12 through 14, it says that you're supposed to take certain poles, you're supposed to put them through the rings, they're supposed to be carried by the priests, and only then after they've been cleansed and so forth. Did they do any of that? Nope. They just pick it up, throw it on an oxen cart, go, let's go. So God's already a bit tiffed because they're already disobeying. Was anyone but the Levite supposed to touch the ark? And even the Levites are only supposed to not really touch it. They're supposed to sprinkle blood on it at certain times, certain things. So no one is supposed to touch the ark. Does it say? It says the oxen stumbled. Does it say the ark was falling? No. We've always assumed the ark was falling. It does not state the ark was falling. Uzzah reached up and touched the thing, not because it was stumbling. He may have just moved a little bit or whatever. Is he supposed to do that? And this was done in front of all of Israel. What is God doing? He's teaching him, that's, you're darn right, teach him that you don't approach me that way. And what does it say? David, what happened to David as a result of it? He, not just anger, then the next verse it says, and then he feared the Lord. David needed a little bit more fear of the Lord in him. And so they broke the law on how they moved it. There is no indication it was actually falling. Uzzah wasn't keeping it from falling on the ground or anything. And he knew, he'd been living with the thing. He knew what it was. He knew better than that. And so you got to keep all of that in mind. Make sense? All righty.
And what was in it besides the tablets?
Aaron's rod, or Moses' rod, really, that bud. Mammon, yeah, and mammon. The manna from heaven.
Just 3 things.
Just a few things. Yeah. Yeah, that's what was in it, but it was symbolically the symbol of God's presence, which is why you were not to. It was basically it was considered basically his throne on earth. And so you were not to approach it. You would not have, in the ancient Near East, you would not approach any king's throne without showing a lot of respect and dignity, correct? It's the same thing. God is saying, you're going to approach me, even more careful than you would an earthly king.
Where's it rumored at to be today?
It was probably destroyed. You got to remember, Jerusalem was sacked. The question is, where's the ark today? Jerusalem was sacked several times. And typically when it was sacked, they would take the treasures with them. And in all likelihood, the ark was taken and melted down.
There's some theories it's in Ethiopia.
Yeah, but and then every time they're asked to show it, they say, oh, we can't do that. And they won't allow anyone in to see it without a camera either. They say, oh, it's in there, but we can't show it to you. Yeah, whatever. I don't think so. All right. Another problem. 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21 have a little bit of a problem with David and the census. You ever seen this one? It says, a number of English translations in 2 Samuel 24:1 say God moved David to take a census, and then he got mad at David for taking the census. And then 1 Chronicles 21 says it was Satan who moved David to take a census. Well, what's the problem and who did the moving? Here. Well, here's the deal. I don't expect all of you to try to learn Hebrew. I have to do it. You don't. There are better ways for you to spend your time. Trust me. The problem is one of translating ancient Hebrew. In 2 Samuel 24:1, there is actually no subject for the verb incited or moved. Translators have inserted God there in some translations. It does not say God moved David. It just says, it literally says this. It says, there was who moved David against them. That's what the Hebrew says. Nobody accused the writer of 2 Samuel of having good English. They just said, it says David was moved. Or for one moved David against them. That's literally what the Hebrew says. It doesn't say who moved David. It probably was Satan, as 1 Chronicles 21 states. Does not say that God did it. So I think that there's actually the only problem there is in the English translation, not in the Hebrew. The Hebrew does not say God moved David. It does say God got ticked off at David. Why did God get ticked off at David for conducting a census?
Find out how many men he had, rely on them instead of God.
God says, you just trust me, bub. I got this. Yeah, I mean, this is the funny thing. It's like when he tells Joshua and Moses, he says, I'm going to send my angels ahead of you. When he sends angels ahead of you, he says, and they even said they could hear the angels like marching in the trees. They could actually hear the angels on the move. When God sends, and then Joshua and Moses, the Israelites, they're still scared. I'm like, if you've got an army of unkillable soldiers going in front of you, and you're still scared, you need to grow a pair. I mean, goodness sakes, because that's... God says this, when you go out to war, if I send you out to war, I'm going with you. And if God goes with you, he ain't going to lose. And so that's why he was mad at David. He said, why are you taking a census for? Exodus is very clear. The only person who could order Israel to take a census was God. And so David again misbehaved, broke the law, whatever you want to say. One other thing before we quit. In 2 Samuel 11 and in other places, and also here, why is it that when David screws up, which he does a lot, why is it that Israel's punished for it? After the census, what happens? All Israel's punished for it. Why? Okay, here's something that we wrestle with, and it's so strange to us in our culture. We live in such an individualistic culture where we think anything we do is just our business and it doesn't affect anyone else. If you think about that for more than 2 seconds, that's stupid. Anything you do has repercussions on everyone else. Right? Like if you drive slow in the left lane to Boston. The repercussion is it makes me mad and I have to repent. They need to drive slower. They need to stay home. And they need to stay home or they need to get into the right lane. They ain't moving to Portsmouth. Everybody just needs to get out of my way. That's the answer. There should be the right lane and Matt's lane, and that's how it is. Oh, that too. Goodness sakes. When is that road going to be finished?
Next year.
Yeah, that's what they say. Anyway, this is when we were talking about Adam last week. We're all suffering from Adam's sin, are we not? Adam represented humankind, and as our representative, when he screwed up, we all paid the price. King David represented Israel to God. If he screwed up, he represented the entire nation. Now, we don't like to think that way, but it's true. This still happens. Look, if Trump screws up, it's going to screw all of us. It happens. We like to think we're just all these little islands in the stream. We just do it. That's not how it works. If somebody above us screws up, somebody in our family screws up, it affects everybody. And that's just the way things work. We can sit there and say, not fair, not fair, not fair, but it's the way it is. It always rolls downhill, exactly. All right, here's what we're going to do. Next week, we're going to polish off the Old Testament. We're going to look at a number of things like, for example, did Enoch and Elijah get to go to heaven? Directly go to heaven? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what's the deal with Elisha. You always wonder, could God not have found somebody that didn't sound so similar to take Elijah's place? Isn't that confusing? Elijah or Elisha? It's like, doesn't it sound a little harsh? And in 2 Kings, when Elisha, he gets called a baldy by a bunch of teenagers, and they get mauled to death by wild animals. Isn't that a little harsh? So we'll look at all that stuff next week. If you have any other questions, let me know. We just got 2 weeks left of this, so next week we'll polish off the Old Testament. Then we move into the New Testament. We'll talk about some of the things like, are there differences in the Gospels? Or there, what's going on when Jesus calls a woman a dog? Yeah, we'll talk about that kind of stuff. So, all right, till then, I can get ready to preach, and you probably need some caffeine and sugar because we're all about health here at Christ Community Church. So, go get your coffee and your donuts, and I'll see you next week. See you, Facebook.
Christ Community meets on Saturday at 5 p.m. and Sunday at 10:30 a.m. For more information, visit www.christcommunity.net or check out our Facebook page.